Good afternoon from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephanie Plusinski from the Office of Communications. Thank you for joining us today for the Prelaunch News Conference for the next SpaceX cargo resupply mission to the International Space Station for NASA's Commercial Resupply Services Program. Liftoff of the uncrewed SpaceX Dragon spacecraft atop the company's Falcon 9 rocket, carrying supplies, hardware, and science investigations, is currently targeted for no earlier than tomorrow, June 3rd at 12:35 p.m. Eastern Time. Teams from NASA and SpaceX just completed the launch readiness review, and senior representatives are here to talk with us more about this important milestone. With us today are Phil Dempsey, Transportation Integration Manager for NASA's International Space Station Program, Kurt Costello, Chief Scientist for NASA's International Space Station Program Research Office, Sarah Walker, SpaceX's Dragon Mission Management Director, and Arlena Moses, Launch Weather Officer for Cape Canaveral Space Force Station's 45th Weather Squadron. Our speakers will each provide opening remarks, then we'll move to questions from reporters on the phone. To enter the question queue, please use *1. To start, we'll hear from Phil Dempsey, Transportation Integration Manager for NASA's International Space Station Program.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're here to discuss the upcoming launch of the SpaceX-28 cargo resupply mission to the International Space Station, scheduled to launch Saturday, June 3rd at 11:35 a.m. Central Time. SpaceX-28 will dock Monday, June 5th, to the zenith port of the Harmony module on the International Space Station at 4:36 a.m. Central Time and remain for about 3 weeks. Inside Dragon will be nearly 7,000 pounds of cargo, research investigations, and supplies. That's made up of 4,335 pounds of pressurized cargo inside the Dragon and 2,635 pounds unpressurized in the trunk. SpaceX's Dragon will deliver new science investigations, food, which includes fresh apples, blueberries, grapefruit, oranges, various cheeses, and tomatoes for the crew, crew supplies, and equipment for the international crew, including the next pair of IROSAs, which are the International Space Station rollout solar arrays. The solar panels, which roll out using stored energy, expand the energy production capabilities of the space station. The ones on SpaceX-28 will be the 5th and 6th IROSAs launching in SpaceX's Dragon's trunk. Each new IROSA will produce more than 20 kilowatts of electricity, and once all are installed, enables a 30% increase in power production over the station's current arrays. Following SpaceX-28's arrival, we'll have the first in a series of spacewalks on June 9th, where NASA astronauts Steve Bowen and Woody Hoburg will work to install one of the arrays on the 1A power channel on the starboard truss. A second spacewalk, scheduled for June 15th, will install an IROSA on the 1B power channel on the starboard truss. Assignments for USEV-88 will be determined at a later date. Recently, on Tuesday of this week, AX-2 undocked and completed its mission with splashdown off the coast of Panama City, completing 9 days in orbit. Congrats to SpaceX, Axiom, and NASA teams on their hard work to make this possible. And then looking ahead to Soyuz MS-23's return, we're targeting a September 27th landing of the Soyuz. On that, Frank Rubio will have spent 371 days in space, which will be the longest continuous U.S. record for human in space. So again, a big thank you to the tremendous work of our combined SpaceX and NASA teams as we look forward to having SpaceX-28 on board and delivering the new solar arrays. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kurt.
Thanks, Phil. This SpaceX-28 launch brings a great mix of payloads to add to the over 3,700 investigations flown to the ISS to date. These investigators take advantage of the long-duration microgravity and space environment to conduct biological science, physical science, earth science, space science, technology demonstrations, and human research on the space station. Like you mentioned, the payload of SpaceX-28 brings 265 kilograms of science to be conducted over these 21 dock days, and that's 31 payloads from NASA and its international partners. I'd like to share the details of a few of these investigations with you now. The first, our Canadian Space Agency partner, is flying CubeSats from York University. These CubeSats, one of them is called Essence, and it will be looking at the Arctic regions of northern Canada for both Arctic ice and measurements of permafrost melting. These are two measurements that can help us in our understanding of global climate change, and the CubeSat itself will be in orbit for a year to a year and a half. Next up, from our European Space Agency, we have a payload called Thor Davis. Thor Davis is looking for upward-directed lightning events over the tops of thunderclouds. So the ISS is a perfect vantage point for these kinds of observations. They'll be using an electronic combination with a camera from a nadir window to capture what are known as blue jets and other lightning phenomena. And this was submitted by Olivier Chanrion of the Danish Technical University. Next up, we have an ISS National Lab investigation, Genes in Space 10. This investigation is sponsored by the Boeing Corporation. They run a student-based competition to find proposals for new genetics research that can be conducted on the ISS. This is a great developmental program, and we really have some great investigators come out of it. This one, the PI, is Pristine Onuahu, and she is investigating a method to measure telomeres on orbit. This is a great example of what it means to have a space station that can conduct research over multiple years. Pristine was actually inspired in this investigation by the Year in Space and the twin study that were conducted earlier on the space station. These studies looked at the lengthening of telomeres in twins Mark and Scott Kelly. Pristine has asked the question, how can we measure the telomere lengthening in space? In the previous study, we were only able to get the measurements before and after flight for the astronauts. So it's really tough to say what happened to those telomeres in space. So this investigation looks at a technique where through fluorescence tagging on DNA, you can measure the length of a DNA snippet proportional to how long that is using a fluorescence imager that will be provided for the experiment. This is exciting research, and it really shows how we can build on the results of past research from the ISS and how it can inspire young minds to think about new ways to examine the forces of microgravity on the space station. And last but not least, we have an investigation called Plant Habitat 03. This is provided by Dr. Annalisa Paul of the University of Florida, Gainesville. And this is actually a continuation of the first half of this investigation, which just returned on SpaceX 27. So in this investigation, she is looking at the model plant organism Arabidopsis thaliana, and we are trying to understand how the stresses related to microgravity, biological organisms living in microgravity, in this case plants, adapting to those stresses can be passed on to future generations. So as I said, the initial experiment part just returned on SpaceX 27. From that, they harvested seeds and replanted them, which are now flying on SpaceX 28. When we have the grow out complete in our advanced plant habitat, we'll be taking those plant samples back down to the ground to understand if the epigenome of these plants has changed and it is passed on to the next generation. Something interesting, very interesting for future biologicals flying in space. And with that, I'll pass it on to Sarah Walker.
Thanks for having me today. You know, our vehicle is largely the same flight after flight, but I love hearing how different the science NASA's accomplishing with it is every single time. Thanks, Kurt. That was really cool. It's been a busy week for my team, as Phil mentioned, so we safely returned Axiom 2 home from the space station and to their families on Tuesday. And here we are less than 24 hours from the launch of our next resupply mission. We were thrilled that the weather cooperated to undock and bring home the Axiom 2 crew on Tuesday specifically because it was a very special day for us here at SpaceX for another reason. It marks the 3rd anniversary of returning human spaceflight capability to the United States with the launch of Demo 2 on May 30th, 3 years ago. So what a week, wow. And in the midst of all these milestones this week, we are just as honored to be launching our 28th cargo resupply mission to the ISS tomorrow, especially knowing it carries the 3rd set of ISS rollout solar arrays like everyone has been talking about and other critical supplies in science. In my mind, this mission continues a rich history of Dragon on-orbit presence at ISS since our first visit to the space station back in 2012. So as always, the safety of each mission and all involved remains our top priority. So we had a successful launch readiness review just a couple hours ago. The teams are now in final preparation to launch Falcon 9 and Dragon to the space station. It was a clean data review, and we're currently tracking no constraints against tomorrow's launch. The last of the time-critical cargo is also being loaded right now out at LC-39A. So thank you for including me in today's briefing. Again, it was really fun to hear about all the science that's being done this mission, and thanks from all of us here at SpaceX to NASA for your trust, partnership, and close collaboration every single mission. And thanks to the 45th for enabling tomorrow's launch. Arlena, how's the weather looking?
Thank you, Sarah. Well, we'll do our part with getting the weather to make sure we can get all of that critical science and resupply supplies back up to ISS. So most people, of course, have their eyes on the tropics currently with the development of what was Tropical Depression 2 in the Eastern Gulf. And as of 2 p.m. Today is now Tropical Storm Arlene. No relation, unfortunately. I can't take credit for the name. But as we've seen in the past couple of days and will continue to be the case, Arlene is likely to be a short-lived system, and it's going to drift just to the south, remaining well offshore of Florida in the Gulf, and not anticipated to have any direct impacts on our local weather, including our launch weather as we go into tomorrow. However, the kind of tropical air mass around Arlene that is kind of induced into the state here will continue to bring periods of showers and occasionally thunderstorms into the coast here, and that is our primary concern continuing into our launch window midday tomorrow. Right now, we are looking at that probability of violation of about 70%. But I will caution, don't let the high number scare you as much as it seems. What that's really reflective of is the likelihood that we may have a couple rounds of showers or storms kind of pass through while we're preparing for our launch tomorrow. And hopefully, the main thing that's important is that we can have a clear weather as we go right down towards our Tier 0. That's really the most important thing in terms of our launch weather. Similar weather as we go into Sunday, as we'll be looking at that probability of violation or really having any weather constraints get violated. Still about 70% on Sunday. Weather remains very similar, those kind of passing onshore showers, maybe an occasional thunderstorm. But the good thing is we kind of have to continue to look at the weather into Monday. We will start to get a little bit of drying in here as whatever is left of Arlene at that point gets kind of swept out to sea and takes with it a lot of the tropical moisture. And right now on Monday, our probability of violation is only about 50%, still kind of watching those kind of showers in the vicinity. Unfortunately, a lot of times as we start to get this time of year, that's the kind of weather here in Florida, is watching our thunderstorms. But we'll do our part, of course, with the 45th Weather Squadron to make sure we have a safe launch in terms of weather and get our supplies up. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Arlena, and thank you, everyone. We'll now move into the question and answer portion of our call. As a reminder, please use *1 to enter the queue. When called upon, please state to whom you're addressing your question to, and please limit to one question at a time. To begin, we'll start with Stephen Clark with Spaceflight Now.
Hi, all. Thanks for taking my question. I apologize. I joined a couple of minutes late, so this question may have already been answered, but I think for Mr. Dempsey, what are the launch opportunities after tomorrow in terms of phasing with the ISS, and are there any payloads or anything time-sensitive on Dragon that needs to be serviced after, 24 or 48 hours that we have to stand down? And another one for you, Mr. Dempsey, is the next Northrop Grumman cargo mission still on tap for July? I know it's been delayed a little bit, and can you talk about the reason for that launch not happening yet this year and when that might be scheduled? Thanks.
Okay, let's see. We'll start with opportunities. Yes, I mean, we do have opportunities on Sunday and Monday as well. For Sunday, the launch time would be 11:12 Central Time, with the docking on Tuesday, June 6th at 5:15 a.m. Central. And then on Monday, it'd be 10:47 Central Time a.m. with the docking on Tuesday, June 6th, but at 4:54 a.m. Central. So all of those are the nearest term opportunities that we've got. I believe we'd be able to go handle all of those with the current cargo complement that we have. After that, we would have to go consider what to refresh, and we'll look for new opportunities later in the week. Following, let's see, the next question was on the Northrop Grumman. Our Northrop Grumman partners have been working to go determine when the vehicle's ready to fly, NG-19. That is still being planned through the summer. We don't have a defined launch date for it yet. As with any of our vehicles, we work with the partners between NASA and the commercial partner to understand when the vehicle's ready and when the teams are ready. And that one just wasn't quite ready for the earlier opportunities, and that's why it's been delayed. And we continue to watch and talk frequently with Northrop Grumman as to when during the summer they'll be ready to fly.
All right, we'll now hand it over to Jeff Faust with Space News.
Good afternoon. A question for Phil, just to follow up on that last question. With the issue with the NG-19, is the vehicle readiness with the Cygnus spacecraft or with the Antares launch vehicle?
There's a little bit of both. The primary readiness issue it has to do with just ensuring that what folks are aware happened on NG-18, the launch anomaly that we had that affected the solar array that's out there, then that doesn't recur. And so that's the biggest question of readiness, but at the same time, the partners are always looking at the vehicle readiness as it's marching down as well. So it's really making sure that we have a completely healthy vehicle from launch vehicle and the Cygnus vehicle both.
Thank you. As a reminder, press *1 to be entered into the question queue. With that being said, Kurt, we do have a question for you. How does PH-03 fit into the large spectrum of plant research on the space station?
That's a great question. As far as plant research goes on the ISS, we've been doing it for a number of years in different facilities. And this investigation, Plant Habitat 03, is probably our most complex mission to date, not only because it involves multiple flights where we have to grow out the plant on orbit, take samples, and then prep them on the ground for reflight, but because it's really looking at the genetic nature of how life responds to the microgravity environment and stress that's created from living in that environment. None of the life on Earth obviously was exposed to a zero-G field. We've always grown and developed in a 1G field. So going into that microgravity environment induces stresses. And what we want to know is, are the ways that plants adapt to those microgravity stressors passed on to subsequent generations of plants through their DNA? That's epigenetics, when the environment impacts your genetic code. So what we're doing here is, again, looking at the next generation of plants, the first generation's return on SpaceX 27, and then this one will hopefully help us answer that question. does the genome retain the capability to adapt to a microgravity environment? So it's a very ambitious investigation, and it's also one that really gets at the nature of what it means to live in the microgravity environment. So for that reason, it stands out as one of our most complex and most ambitious missions yet.
Great, thanks, Kurt. We have one more question for you, and we'll wrap up. Unless anybody else has a question on the line, feel free to use *1. The student principal investigator for Genes in Space 10 said she was inspired by the twin study with Scott and Mark Kelly. What other kinds of long-duration human research is happening on the space station?
Also a good question. The twin study was done in the first time we had Scott Kelly on board for a year in space. And so a lot of ISS research in the human research realm wants to understand what really long-duration exposure for our crew members does to their health and their bodies. We have long-duration flight risks that we're constantly mapping in the human research program. Some of the other investigations in the human research program are meant directly to look at those risks, to help us understand for our exploration missions, and especially those to Mars, how the human body will adapt to that microgravity stay, whether it's a year in transit or so, and then a year back. We want to understand what those risks are and how to mitigate them. So one of the investigations being looked at is called CIPHER. CIPHER is actually a collection of 17 different investigations, all looking at long-duration health risks for the astronaut and how we understand what those risks are, if they change after a 6-month duration, which most of our crew, not Mr. Rubio, but others, have only gone about 6 months, so most of our data comes from 6-month studies. But we want to understand up to a year what are the risks, and then how do we mitigate those risks.
Thanks, Kurt. We have another question from Stephen Clark with Spaceflight Now.
Thanks for getting back to me. I think a couple of questions. One for Sarah. The last crew launch had the first, on Axiom 2, had the first LZ-1 RTLS landing for a Dragon mission, or Dragon 2 mission. But for cargo Dragons going forward, I don't think that's the plan. Is it just the simple fact that the cargo Dragons are heavier than Crew Dragon, or is there some other factor that doesn't allow you to return the booster to land on these cargo missions? And for Phil, just to follow up on NG-19, we know the solar array didn't deploy after the launch. I heard there was some kind of contact between the part of the fairing, I think, of the Antares with the solar array that may have damaged that. Is that what's causing this delay in the NG-19 launch? Any modifications to any corrective actions to keep that from happening again? Is that the issue? Thanks.
Hey, yeah, thanks, Stephen. I can go first. So Falcon 9 has been steadily increasing its performance launch over launch, which is really exciting. And that's what enabled us to now have that first stage return to a landing site on our human spaceflight missions when the mission profile or goals allow, right? Like every human spaceflight mission is different, but you look at the trajectory and the mass and see if you have the performance to bring a rocket back. For this mission, we had planned on landing on a shortfall of Gravitas drone ship, but every CRS mission will evaluate, again, the mission's mass needs and performance needs, and the performance of the vehicle against opportunities to return to launch site. They definitely simplify launch operations for us, and they increase our launch opportunity because there's only one localized region that we need GO weather for, right, instead of watching two, one out at sea and one at the launch site. So that's great. And they also let us begin refurbishment sooner, right? It comes right back home, and we put it into the hangar immediately, so we can be ready for the booster's next mission faster. So I think I would just end with saying that safety is always our top priority, right? So there's no risk to Dragon or the cargo by whether we return it to land or a drone ship. We always operate under flight rules and evaluate the data prior to launch to be sure we're ready for the mission, regardless of what the configuration is. But this mission and the mass needs of the science we're flying, the science and the payloads and supplies we're flying this mission, we decided to land out on the drone ship. But it is really exciting that as the vehicle continues to increase its performance, we can sometimes have gains like that on certain missions. And so I'll let you answer the other one.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So back on the NG-19 delays, there's a combination of things that happens with our providers, right? When they have an anomaly on one launch, we work closely with the provider, regardless of who they are, to work with them and understand what happened and what they need to do to ensure that they can preclude it from, with the best, reliable systems that we can, preclude it from happening on the next one. That certainly has been part of what Northrop Grumman has been working with NASA on for this. There are also a lot of other factors that go to flying these spacecraft and these launch vehicles that affects every one of them, every single mission, right? So there actually have been a multitude of factors that go into things that they're working to mitigate each time. And NASA tries to work very closely with each of the providers to understand the risk, as well as to understand when they're ready to go give us a safe, successful mission. So, yes, the making sure that the NG-18 anomaly doesn't happen again has been primary and part of the delays for the NG-19 mission. But certainly there are other things that the Northrop Grumman team is working and communicating from NASA on frequently on every time we go and assess the readiness for one of these.
All right, and for our last question, we'll go over to Jeff Faust of Space News.
Question for Phil. I think you mentioned that SpaceX-28 will be docked to the station for about 3 weeks. Since the Starliner CFT delay means there's no urgency to free up a docking port, is there any thought of extending the Cargo Dragon's time, for example, to be able to bring back more science? Thanks.
So in a general sense, we work with SpaceX to go plan these missions based on what's needed to be done on this one. I think the biggest driver that would drive us to extending it would really be if we needed to go do more EVAs to deal with some of the solar array installation. Beyond that, we still have a desire to get the Dragon back to them to free up the port. I can let Kurt speak as to whether there would be any potential benefit for science if we would try to extend. But again, our overall driver is to go get the mission completed as planned and make sure that we have a safe solar array installation before the Dragon departs.
Great question, Jeff. As far as the science goes, we've already planned out the science for return on SpaceX-28. Like I said, we had 31 payloads going up. We'll be returning science from over 34 payloads. And that is planned for the 21-day duration. So extending beyond that wouldn't necessarily help us out because we've already used up all the room in the end, and we'll be returning that science with SpaceX-28.
All right, thank you, and thank you once again to our panelists for taking time out of your busy pre-launch schedules to talk to us about this important mission. NASA TV coverage of launch begins tomorrow, Saturday, June 3rd at 12:15 p.m. Eastern Time, with liftoff scheduled for 12:35 p.m. Stay tuned to nasa.gov for launch updates, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you. This does conclude today's conference. You may disconnect at this time.